In this video, I want to talk about the concept of adaptation in war. The war in Ukraine has now been going on for 5 weeks, and it's fair to say that things have not worked out well for Russia. They've had many problems, and their assumptions going into the war have proven to be wrong. And as a result of that, they've suffered losses, and they've not achieved any substantial goals. But now it seems that they are learning and adapting, and that might change the dynamics of the war. The Russian campaign in Ukraine has so far been a fiasco. They clearly had very large ambitions with the invasion, but they are nowhere near a realization of those ambitions. So there's not going to be regime change in Ukraine, and they will also not get a demilitarized buffer zone to the west. On the operational front, Russia has had some success in the southern part of Ukraine, but so far they have not managed to conquer Donbas, and their attempts to encircle Kiev have failed. So to list some of the reasons for Russia's failures, they had a terrible plan based on bad assumptions. And this is an intelligence failure. Somehow the leadership in Moscow had gotten the idea that the Ukrainian society was weak and fragile and that the Ukrainians would not fight. So this failure is on the intelligence services, so that's the SVR and the FSB, and it's on Putin himself for creating a system where his subordinates give him wrong information. So there were bad assumptions behind Russia's first plan of a quick war with limited use of force. And this was probably the reasoning behind some of the choices that have made it hard for Russia later on. Like, for example, Russia didn't have a robust air campaign to suppress the Ukrainian air defenses before moving in with their ground forces. And they also immediately dispersed those ground forces across several fronts and had many different military goals at the same time. So if you're familiar with the principles of warfare, you will know that dispersal of forces and a high number of aims are not really good practice. And other principles of war that Russia have struggled with are the maintenance of morale among the soldiers, and problems with logistical sustainment of operations and operational security through the use of secure communication systems. And it also seems that the Russian campaign has suffered from a lack of unified command, because apparently there have been different commanders for different parts of Russia's invasion, and they have competed with each other for resources. But war is the ultimate reality check for bad intelligence. And by now, it should be pretty obvious in Moscow that things aren't going according to plan. And war is also a very explicit illustration of the concept of evolution. It's literally survival of the fittest. And when you're in a situation where you're suffering unsustainable losses and you're not achieving your goals, you can either learn and adapt, or you can stick to your plan and you will lose the war. And I think one of the great unknowns in this war has been how the Russian leadership and in particular Vladimir Putin would react when they realize that things don't work out the way they wanted. Like, how open will Putin be to the idea that his intelligence reports were wrong, and how will he react when he realizes that the Russian army can't achieve the military goals? Will he acknowledge the problem and adapt to the situation, or will he sort of enter a state of denial and stick to the plan that doesn't work? So in practice, sticking to the plan would mean to maintain the same posture in all fronts and send more soldiers and perhaps mobilize reserves or commit conscript soldiers to the fight. Or it could perhaps involve more desperate measures like more devastating weapons, or heaven forbid, weapons of mass destruction, in the hope that it could create some kind of momentum. So that's what sticking to a losing strategy would look like. But as I see it, there are some signs that Russia has realized the situation and are adapting to mitigate their problems. So in the northern part of Ukraine, they have ceased the offensive operations and have instead gone into defensive fighting. And they have officially announced that offensive operations will primarily take place in the Donbas region. And these are rational choices that address many of Russia's shortcomings. And it will also challenge the Ukrainian forces because they will be forced to use different kinds of tactics than the ones that have worked so well for them in the first part of the war. So Ukraine has been very successful in utilizing variations of insurgency warfare with ambushes and trying to pull the fight into the urban areas. But now that Russian forces have gone into defensive positions, those tactics don't work anymore. And instead, the Ukrainians now have to counterattack, which requires different kinds of weapons and tactics. And in the Donbas region, the Russians can conduct offensive actions in a more open terrain where they can better use their tanks and armored vehicles and other weapons. And also, the focus on Donbas addresses the problems that Russia has had with logistics because there are much shorter supply lines that they need to protect. And incidentally, this also coincides with a message from the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu about the spring draft of conscripts in Russia. And he announced that apparently Russia will draft a smaller number of conscripts than usual, and that the conscripts that are ending their service will be sent home as planned. So in other words, the signal from the top in Moscow is that the so-called special military operation in Ukraine will not lead to dramatic measures in Russia to increase the fighting force. So as I see it, the Russian leadership is reacting to the situation in a rational and pragmatic manner. They have realized that their initial assumptions about Ukraine were based on bad intelligence and that the situation is different now. Like, don't get me wrong here. I'm sure Putin is furious about the performance of the Russian military, and definitely there will be scapegoats and somebody will be punished for this. But he does not seem to be in denial about the realities on the battlefield. And it seems that he is willing to let his generals make the necessary adjustments to stop the catastrophe. So we see a Russian military that is learning from their experiences and is adapting to overcome their problems. Of course, that does not change the point I made in my last video that in the bigger picture, Russia has already lost the war because they have lost all hope of a close future relationship with Ukraine. But war is also a contingent activity, and each step is dependent on the outcome of the previous step. And I do think it's a good sign that Russia seems to react rationally to their situation, because this means that there is a possibility that the war could, over time, de-escalate instead of continuing indefinitely, because Russia can redefine their goals into something that is realistic. All right, I will end it here, and this time I think I actually finish on a slightly optimistic note. It seems that Russia has acknowledged that they're in trouble and that Putin is willing to adapt to the situation. And that does leave some room for hope that the war can end somewhere down the road. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again next time.